Philadelphia, October 1918. Before sunrise, the Miller family's row house stood in near darkness, one of hundreds pressed tightly together along a narrow working-class street. The brick walls shared warmth, noise, and sometimes illness. On ordinary mornings, the neighborhood awakened to factory whistles, rattling delivery carts, children calling to one another, and streetcars grinding along their metal tracks. But this was not an ordinary morning. The city was in the grip of influenza. Inside the Miller home, Eleanor Miller opened her eyes before the alarm clock rang. She remained still for several seconds, listening. Her husband, Thomas, breathed heavily beside her, but his breathing was steady. From the next room came the faint creak of a bed frame as their teenage daughter, Ruth, turned beneath her blankets. Their 9-year-old son, Samuel, appeared to be sleeping quietly. Only after hearing no cough did Eleanor allow herself to rise. In homes across the United States, families had begun their days in much the same way. A cough was no longer dismissed as a minor irritation. A headache, chill, or unusual tiredness could be the first sign of a disease that sometimes killed within days. Healthy adults had left for work in the morning and become seriously ill before evening. Newspapers carried stories of hospitals filled beyond capacity, nurses working until they collapsed, and undertakers unable to meet the demand for coffins. For Eleanor, the first responsibility of each morning was no longer breakfast. It was observation. She dressed in a plain cotton blouse and a long dark skirt, pinned her brown hair behind her head, and crossed the cold bedroom floor. The house had no central heating. Downstairs, the coal stove had nearly gone out during the night, leaving the kitchen chilled and damp. Eleanor knelt before it, opened the iron door, and stirred the ashes with a poker. A few red embers remained. She added scraps of newspaper, thin pieces of wood, and 2 carefully measured lumps of coal. Coal was expensive, and every piece had to last. The flame slowly returned. On the kitchen table lay the previous evening's newspaper. The headline warned of more influenza deaths in Philadelphia. Beneath it, smaller notices announced that schools, theaters, churches, dance halls, and other public gathering places remained closed. Only weeks earlier, Philadelphia had held a massive parade to promote the sale of war bonds. Thousands of people had crowded the streets, standing shoulder to shoulder while soldiers marched and bands played. Public health officials had warned that influenza was already spreading among military personnel, but the parade went forward. Soon afterward, hospitals began filling with patients. The Miller family did not know how many people at the parade had carried the virus. They did not understand viruses in the modern sense. Medical science had not yet identified influenza as a viral infection, and the public received conflicting advice about how it spread and how it could be prevented. Still, people understood that close contact was dangerous. Eleanor folded the newspaper, so the death figures were hidden before the children came downstairs. She filled a basin with water and added a small amount of disinfectant. The sharp chemical smell spread through the kitchen. She wiped the table, the door handles, and the back of each wooden chair. She cleaned the pump handle near the sink and the metal latch on the front door. Whether these actions could truly protect the family was uncertain. But cleaning gave Eleanor something practical to do. In a time when families had few effective medical defenses, routine provided a fragile sense of control. Upstairs, Thomas began to dress for work. He was 38 years old, broad-shouldered, and usually energetic. He worked as a streetcar conductor, collecting fares and helping passengers board. His job placed him in close contact with hundreds of people each day. When he entered the kitchen, Eleanor studied his face. "You sleep well?" she asked. "Well enough. No headache?" "No." "Any soreness?" Thomas paused while buttoning his shirt. "Eleanor, I'm fine." She did not answer immediately. Instead, she placed the back of her hand against his forehead. He allowed it, though his expression showed mild impatience. "No fever," she said. "I told you. You also told me last winter that you were fine, and then you spent 3 days in bed." "That was a cold." "This is not a cold." Thomas looked toward the folded newspaper. "I know." The room became quiet except for the crackling stove. Thomas faced the same question confronting countless American workers during the epidemic. Was it safer to remain at home, or was it necessary to continue earning wages? There was no paid sick leave for men like him. If he did not work, he did not get paid. The rent would still be due. Coal, food, and medicine would still cost money. The family had modest savings, but not enough to survive many weeks without income. Remaining home might reduce the risk of infection, but poverty carried its own dangers. Eleanor poured hot water into a metal cup and added a spoonful of coffee substitute. Real coffee had become harder to obtain during wartime. She placed 2 slices of bread near the stove to toast and spread a thin layer of apple preserves across them. Fewer people are riding, Thomas said. The car was half empty yesterday. Half empty is still people. I stand near the door. I keep my face covered. The cloth gets wet when you breathe. I change it at midday. Eleanor placed the bread in front of him. You touch coins all day. I wash my hands. You touch the bell rope. I wipe it down. You cannot wipe down the passengers. Thomas looked at her, not angrily, but with exhaustion. What do you want me to do? Eleanor lowered her eyes. She wanted him to stay home. She wanted the doors locked, the windows sealed, and the entire family protected from the invisible danger moving through the city. But she also knew that the food in the cupboard would not replenish itself. I want you to come back tonight, she said. Thomas softened. I will. Neither of them believed that such a promise could be guaranteed. Ruth entered the kitchen wearing a gray dress and wool stockings. At 16, she was old enough to understand more than her parents wished. She had read newspaper reports about young adults dying in great numbers. Some had been only a few years older than she was. Samuel followed her, dragging one hand along the wall and rubbing his eyes. Do I have school today? He asked. You know the school is closed, Ruth said. Samuel climbed into his chair. Then why do I still have lessons? Because influenza does not excuse arithmetic, Eleanor replied. Samuel frowned as though the illness had personally betrayed him. In thousands of American homes, school closures had moved education into kitchens and sitting rooms. Parents who had little time or training became temporary teachers. Older children helped younger siblings. Lessons were completed between household chores, food preparation, and efforts to care for sick relatives. Eleanor served the children oatmeal made thinner than usual, so the supply would last longer. She added a small amount of molasses for sweetness. Thomas tied a folded gauze mask around his face. The masks used during the 1918 epidemic varied widely. Some were made from several layers of gauze. Others were simple pieces of cloth tied behind the head. Public health authorities in several American cities encouraged or required their use, though their quality and effectiveness depended greatly on construction and proper use. To Samuel, his father's mask made him look like a doctor. Will everyone on the streetcar wear one? The boy asked. No, Thomas said. Why not? Some people do not like being told what to do. Even if it keeps them from getting sick? Thomas placed his cap on his head. Especially then. Ruth gave a brief laugh, but Eleanor did not. At the front door, Thomas pulled on his coat. Eleanor handed him a small paper parcel containing another mask and a clean handkerchief. Do not eat near anyone, she said. I know. And stay away from anyone coughing. I will try. And when you return, leave your coat by the door. Thomas nodded. He looked at the children. Help your mother. Ruth promised she would. Samuel asked whether Thomas would bring home the evening newspaper. If they still print one, Thomas said. He opened the door. Cold morning air entered the hallway, carrying the smell of damp brick, coal smoke, and fallen leaves. The street outside was quieter than it should have been. No children hurried toward school. No church bells called worshippers to morning services. Several houses had curtains drawn even though the sun was rising. Across the street, a white cloth had been tied to the handle of the Sullivan family's front door. It was a signal that illness was inside. Thomas looked at it for a moment. Mr. Sullivan had worked at a shipyard supporting the war effort. 2 days earlier, he had developed a fever. By the following evening, his wife and oldest son were also sick. No one on the street knew their exact condition. Neighbors left food on the front step but avoided entering. Fear had created a difficult balance between compassion and self-preservation. People wanted to help, yet every act of help could expose another household. Thomas stepped outside. Eleanor watched from the doorway as he walked toward the streetcar line. He passed shuttered shops and public notices nailed to wooden posts. One notice advised citizens to cover coughs and sneezes. Another warned against public gatherings. A third encouraged anyone with symptoms to remain at home. Yet men and women still moved through the city, because work had not stopped entirely. Factories producing military supplies remained open. Streetcars continued running. Stores sold essential goods. Policemen, nurses, telephone operators, delivery drivers, and laborers reported for duty despite the danger. The United States was still fighting a world war. Only 1 month remained before the armistice, but the people of Philadelphia did not know that. They lived between two emergencies, a global war overseas and an epidemic at home. Eleanor closed the door and slid the lock into place. When she returned to the kitchen, Ruth was looking through the window at the Sullivan house. "Mrs. Sullivan asked me yesterday if I could bring some broth," Ruth said. "You left it on the step. She said she might need help with the younger children." Eleanor stopped wiping the counter. "You are not going inside that house. What if they have no one else? They have relatives. The relatives live across the river. Then the city should send someone. The city has too many sick people." Eleanor looked at her daughter. Ruth was not being careless. She was frightened, but she also understood that the Sullivans were alone. Public health systems were overwhelmed. Hospitals lacked beds. Visiting nurses could not reach every household. Volunteer organizations delivered food, cared for children, and assisted families in quarantine, but the need was far greater than the available help. "I can leave supplies outside," Ruth continued. "I do not have to go in." "That is all you will do?" Ruth nodded. From upstairs came a sudden sound. A cough. Eleanor froze. Samuel looked up from his oatmeal. Ruth turned toward the staircase. For several seconds no one moved. Then the cough came again, dry, sharp, and unmistakable. Eleanor slowly set down the cloth in her hand. The quiet morning inside the Miller home had just changed. For several seconds, Eleanor Miller did not move. The cough came again from somewhere above them, followed by a scraping sound against the wall. Ruth stood so quickly that her chair struck the floor behind her. "Samuel, stay here," Eleanor said. "But I'm already here." "Then stay exactly where you are." Eleanor climbed the narrow staircase with Ruth close behind her. The upper hallway was cold, and the small bedroom doors stood open. Samuel's bed was empty. Ruth's blankets were still folded back from where she had risen. The parents' room contained no one. Then the cough came a third time. This time, Eleanor understood. It was not inside their home. The sound had traveled through the shared brick wall from the Sullivan house next door. In Philadelphia's tightly packed row house neighborhoods, families lived only inches apart. Voices, footsteps, crying babies, arguments, and illness could pass through walls that seemed solid during daylight. A cough in the neighboring bedroom could sound as though it came from the foot of one's own bed. Eleanor pressed her palm against the cold plaster. On the other side of the wall, someone was struggling to breathe. Ruth looked at her mother. "That was Mrs. Sullivan." "You cannot know that. I heard her coughing yesterday." Eleanor lowered her hand. The sound came again, weaker than before. By October 1918, scenes like this were unfolding in cities across the United States. Families often had little warning before influenza entered a household. One person might return home with a headache or mild fever. Within a day, several relatives could become sick. In severe cases, patients developed pneumonia, their breathing became labored, and their skin took on a bluish color from lack of oxygen. Doctors had few reliable treatments. They could recommend rest, fluids, warmth, and isolation. Some prescribed aspirin in doses that would later be considered dangerously high. Patent medicines promised protection without evidence. Families used mustard plasters, alcohol rubs, herbal tonics, vapor treatments, and whatever remedies had been passed down through generations. Most of these measures could provide comfort. None could stop the virus. Downstairs, Samuel called from the kitchen. "Is someone sick?" Eleanor turned away from the wall. "Finish your breakfast." "That means yes," he replied. When Eleanor and Ruth returned to the kitchen, Samuel had not touched his oatmeal. He sat with his hands in his lap, staring at the ceiling. "Can influenza come through walls?" he asked. "No," Eleanor said. Are you certain? It spreads between people, not through bricks. The answer was reassuring, but incomplete. Medical advice in 1918 was often inconsistent, and ordinary Americans did not always understand the exact mechanisms of infection. They knew that coughs and sneezes were dangerous. They were warned not to share drinking cups, towels, or utensils. They were told to avoid crowds and keep rooms ventilated. Yet the invisible nature of the disease encouraged fear of almost everything. Clothing, mail, money, groceries, door handles, and even the air itself. Eleanor opened the kitchen window a few inches. Cold wind entered the room. Samuel pulled his sweater tighter. I thought we were supposed to stay warm. We are also supposed to have fresh air. What if the fresh air has influenza in it? Ruth placed his chair closer to the stove. Then we will make it too uncomfortable to stay. Samuel did not appear convinced. The family resumed the morning routine, though the sound from the Sullivan house remained in their thoughts. Ruth washed the breakfast bowls while Eleanor prepared broth. She placed chicken bones, an onion, carrots, and water into a heavy pot. Nothing could be wasted. The meat had already been eaten the previous evening, but the bones could still provide flavor and nourishment. Food had become one of the most practical forms of assistance during the epidemic. When every adult in a household became sick, neighbors often left soup, bread, milk, or coal outside the door. Churches and relief organizations organized deliveries, even while public services were strained. Women volunteers prepared meals in large kitchens. Boy Scouts carried messages. Teachers checked on absent families. Automobile owners transported nurses and doctors through crowded streets. The epidemic isolated households, but survival still depended on community. By late morning, the broth was ready. Eleanor poured it into a covered metal container and wrapped it in a towel. She handed it to Ruth. You leave it on the front step, she said. I know. You knock once and come straight back. I know. You do not touch the door. Ruth took the container. Mother, I know. Eleanor helped tie a clean cloth mask over her daughter's nose and mouth. The mask was made from several layers of gauze and secured behind her head. It was uncomfortable, especially when dampened by breath, but Eleanor had sewn several for the family after public notices encouraged their use. Ruth stepped outside. The street was brighter now but no livelier. A delivery wagon moved slowly past the houses. The driver wore a scarf over his face. Farther down the block, a woman shook a rug from an upstairs window, then quickly withdrew when two men carrying a stretcher emerged from a doorway. Ruth looked away. The Sullivan house stood only a few steps from her own, but the distance felt much greater. She placed the broth beside the door. Before she could knock, the door opened. A little girl stood inside. It was Mary Sullivan, 7 years old. Her red hair had not been combed, and she wore a nightgown beneath an oversized wool coat. Her face was pale. Ruth stepped back immediately. Mary, you should be inside. Mama won't wake up. Ruth felt her stomach tighten. Is your father awake? He's upstairs. Can he speak? Mary shook her head. What about Patrick? He's sleeping. Ruth looked toward her own house. Through the front window, she could see Eleanor watching. Do you have water? Ruth asked. There's some in the pitcher. Food. Mary stared at the container on the step. Ruth pushed it forward with the toe of her shoe. This is broth. Take it inside, but use a cloth around the handle. It may be hot. Mary did not move. Mama said not to open the door. She was right. But I heard you. Ruth's voice softened. You did the right thing telling me. From inside the house came another deep cough, followed by a low moan. Mary turned toward the staircase. Ruth knew her mother was watching. She also knew that crossing the threshold could expose her to the same illness consuming the Sullivan family. This was one of the cruelest choices created by the epidemic. Helping could be dangerous. Doing nothing could be worse. I'm going to get a nurse, Ruth said. Close the door and do not open it unless you hear my voice or my mother's. Mary looked frightened. Will Mama wake up? Ruth could not answer honestly. She needs someone who knows how to help her. Mary picked up the broth with both hands and closed the door. Ruth hurried back home. Eleanor opened their door before she reached it. You spoke to her. Mrs. Sullivan won't wake up. Eleanor's expression changed. Did you go inside? No. Did she touch you? No. Are you certain? Yes. Ruth pulled off the mask. We have to send someone. Eleanor looked down the street. The nearest telephone was at a pharmacy 3 blocks away. The Miller family did not own one. Most working-class American households in 1918 did not have private telephone service. In an emergency, families relied on neighbors, corner stores, police call boxes, or messengers. Eleanor could not leave Samuel alone, and she would not send Ruth into the streets unless necessary. Then she remembered Mrs. Donnelly, a widow 2 houses away. Her eldest son worked at the pharmacy and sometimes came home during the midday meal. Eleanor crossed the street and knocked on Mrs. Donnelly's door without entering. After several minutes, the widow appeared behind the glass. The Sullivans need a nurse. Eleanor called through the door. Mrs. Donnelly understood immediately. I'll send Michael to the pharmacy when he comes. They may not have that long. The widow disappeared inside. A few minutes later, she returned carrying a handbell. She rang it from her front step, an agreed signal used by several families on the block when urgent help was needed. Doors opened cautiously. Faces appeared at windows. Soon, a plan formed without anyone gathering closely. One neighbor would alert the pharmacy. Another would notify the parish relief committee. A third had an automobile and could transport a visiting nurse if one could be found. No one entered the Sullivan home. Not yet. Meanwhile, across the city, Thomas Miller's streetcar moved through nearly empty avenues. He stood near the rear platform, one gloved hand on the rail, and the other ready to collect fares. His mask had already grown damp. Each passenger who boarded seemed to carry a different form of worry. A factory worker sat alone, coughing into a handkerchief. 2 nurses rode together without speaking, their faces gray from exhaustion. An elderly man held a newspaper, but did not turn the page. A woman carrying a basket refused to sit beside anyone, even though nearly every seat was empty. Thomas watched them all. Public transportation was essential to the city, but it also brought strangers into enclosed spaces. Streetcar conductors handled coins passed through hundreds of hands. They worked beside coughing passengers and stood in poorly ventilated cars for hours. At each stop, Thomas wondered whether the next person to climb aboard would bring the illness closer. Near Broad Street, a young man in a military uniform entered the car. He looked barely 20. Sweat covered his forehead despite the cold. You all right? Thomas asked. The soldier handed him a coin. Just tired. He took 2 steps toward an empty seat and collapsed. The streetcar stopped. Several passengers stood, but no one approached. For a moment, the entire car remained silent. Then one of the nurses moved forward. Give me room, she ordered. Thomas opened the windows despite the cold. The nurse knelt beside the soldier and placed 2 fingers against his neck. He has a fever, she said. A bad one. The second nurse helped lift him onto the seat. We need to get him to the hospital. Which hospital? Thomas asked. Whichever one will take him. But hospitals across Philadelphia were already overwhelmed. Beds filled hallways. Medical students were pressed into service. Nurses fell ill alongside their patients. Some hospitals turned people away because there was no space left. The soldier opened his eyes. Don't send me back to camp, he whispered. The nurse looked at Thomas. Keep the car moving. For the next 10 minutes, Thomas drove past 3 crowded medical facilities before an emergency station agreed to receive the young man. By the time the soldier was carried away, Thomas's gloves were wet with sweat from helping move him. He removed them carefully. Then he noticed a dark stain on his sleeve where the soldier's face had rested. That afternoon, Thomas continued working. He had no replacement. He also had no way to tell Eleanor what had happened. Back at the Miller home, a volunteer nurse finally arrived at the Sullivan house shortly before sunset. She wore a dark coat over her uniform and carried a worn leather bag. Eleanor watched from her window as the nurse tied on a mask, entered the house, and closed the door behind her. Nearly an hour passed. The nurse emerged with Mary Sullivan holding her hand. The girl carried a small bundle of clothing. Mrs. Donnelly opened her door and allowed Mary inside, though she kept the child in a separate back room. Then two men entered the Sullivan house with a stretcher. Eleanor pulled Samuel away from the window. "Is Mrs. Sullivan going to the hospital?" he asked. "I think so." Ruth continued watching. The men carried out a figure covered with blankets. The face was not visible. A second stretcher followed. Night began to settle over the street. Thomas had not yet returned. Eleanor placed a pot of water on the stove, so he could wash as soon as he entered. A clean shirt waited by the front door. His evening meal remained covered on the table. 6 o'clock passed. Then 6:30. At 7, the sound of footsteps came from outside. The lock turned, and Thomas entered slowly. His face was pale above the edge of his mask. His coat sleeve had been scrubbed so hard that the fabric was still wet. Eleanor moved toward him. "You're late." Thomas closed the door behind him. There was trouble on the car. He removed his cap, but his hand trembled. Eleanor saw it. "Thomas, I'm only cold." She touched his forehead. This time his skin was hot. Eleanor's hand remained against Thomas's forehead. His skin felt warmer than it had that morning, but the cold air outside and the heavy wool of his uniform made certainty difficult. In October 1918, a household thermometer was valuable but not universal. The Millers owned one, a narrow glass instrument kept inside a cardboard case in the kitchen cabinet. "Sit down," Eleanor said. "I have been sitting all day." "Then sit somewhere I can see you." Thomas lowered himself into the wooden chair near the door. Ruth moved closer, but Eleanor raised one hand. "Stay back." The instructions sounded harsher than she intended. Ruth stopped. Samuel stood at the edge of the kitchen, watching his father with frightened eyes. He had spent the afternoon asking whether influenza could enter through walls. Now the danger appeared to have walked through the front door wearing his father's coat. Eleanor untied Thomas's mask without touching its damp center. She dropped it into a pot reserved for boiling cloths and masks. His coat remained near the entrance. His gloves were placed inside a metal basin. "Wash your hands," she said. Thomas did not argue. He scrubbed with soap while Eleanor opened the thermometer case. She shook the instrument several times, then placed it beneath his tongue. The family waited. Outside, wagon wheels rolled over the street. Somewhere nearby, a door closed. The usual evening sounds of conversation, music, and children playing were absent. Philadelphia had become a city listening for coughs. After several minutes, Eleanor removed the thermometer and held it near the lamp. 99, she said. Thomas gave a tired smile. "Not a fever." "Not yet." "Eleanor, you said a soldier collapsed on your car." "I did not say he had influenza." "You said he was burning with fever." "That could mean many things." "In this city? This month?" Thomas looked away. He had hoped to spare the family from the details, but the stain on his sleeve and the tremor in his hand had already revealed enough. He described the young soldier, the crowded hospitals, and the nurse who had ordered him to help. Ruth listened from across the room. "Did he cough on you?" she asked. "He was unconscious." "That is not an answer." Thomas looked at his daughter. "Yes." The word settled heavily over the kitchen. During the influenza pandemic, exposure did not guarantee illness, and illness did not always become severe. Many people recovered after several days of fever, aches, and exhaustion. But the epidemic's speed and unpredictability made every exposure terrifying. A person could appear healthy in the morning and be unable to stand by nightfall. Eleanor began making decisions. Thomas would sleep downstairs in the small sitting room. No one would use his cup, plate, towel, or blanket. The kitchen window would remain partly open despite the cold. Ruth would care for Samuel, while Eleanor would bring Thomas food and water. These precautions resembled public health recommendations circulated throughout American cities. Sick family members were to be isolated whenever possible. Caregivers were encouraged to wear masks, wash frequently, ventilate rooms, and avoid unnecessary contact. Yet such instructions assumed that families had extra rooms, clean water, sufficient fuel, and enough healthy adults to divide responsibilities. Many did not. The Miller home had only 2 bedrooms and a narrow sitting room. Privacy was limited. Distance had to be created through furniture, schedules, and discipline. Thomas ate alone near the stove. His appetite remained normal, which Eleanor considered encouraging. He finished the stew, drank water, and insisted that he felt only exhausted. Eleanor checked his temperature again at 8 o'clock. It had risen slightly, 99 6/10. Anyone can have that after a long day, he said. Then it will be lower in the morning. Samuel approached carrying a folded piece of paper. I made something for you. Eleanor almost told him to remain back, but Thomas lifted his hand. Leave it on the table, Sam. The boy placed the paper several feet away. It was a drawing of the family standing in front of their house. Thomas wore his conductor's cap. Eleanor stood beside him. Ruth was drawn nearly as tall as both parents, while Samuel had made himself small, but placed at the center. Across the top he had written, "When everyone is well." Thomas stared at the drawing for several seconds. That is very good, he said. Your arms are too long, Ruth observed. They need to be long, Samuel replied, so he can reach all of us without getting close. No one laughed. Thomas folded the drawing and placed it inside his shirt pocket. By 9 o'clock, Ruth had helped Samuel prepare for bed. He did not want to go upstairs. What if Father needs something? Mother will be here. What if Mother gets sick? I will be here. What if you get sick? Ruth pulled the blanket over him. Then you will have to be the responsible one. Samuel looked alarmed. I don't know how. Neither did any of us before this started. She sat beside him, careful not to mention that Mrs. Sullivan had been taken away on a stretcher. Mary remained in Mrs. Donnelly's back room, separated from the widow, while they waited to learn whether the girl would become ill. Will the schools open again? Samuel asked. Yes. Will Father drive the streetcar again? He is a conductor. He doesn't drive it. You know what I mean. Ruth looked toward the window. The Sullivan house was dark. Yes, she said. He will. Her certainty was an act of kindness rather than knowledge. Downstairs, Eleanor prepared the sitting room. She placed a sheet over the narrow sofa and moved a small table beside it. On the table, she set water, a basin, folded cloths, and the thermometer. A kettle remained warming on the stove. Thomas changed into a clean nightshirt. You should sleep upstairs, he told her. I will be in the chair. You cannot stay awake all night. I can try. You will be no help to anyone if you make yourself sick. You are not sick. That is what I have been saying. She looked at him. Thomas sighed. The argument ended without either of them winning. Shortly before 10 o'clock, a knock sounded at the door. Everyone froze. Eleanor approached but did not open it. Who is there? Mrs. Donnelly. The widow stood outside with a covered bowl. Eleanor opened the door only a few inches. It is potato soup, Mrs. Donnelly said. For tomorrow. You should keep it. I have enough. How is Mary? No fever yet. She keeps asking for her mother. And Mrs. Sullivan? Mrs. Donnelly hesitated. The nurse sent word. She is alive. Eleanor released a breath. What about Patrick and Mr. Sullivan? The hospital took Patrick. His father stayed in the house. A volunteer is with him. The two women stood on opposite sides of the doorway. Before the epidemic, Mrs. Donnelly might have entered, placed the bowl on the table, and remained for conversation. Now she left it on the step and moved away before Eleanor picked it up. Such gestures became part of daily life during the pandemic. Compassion was expressed through distance. Meals were left outside. Messages were shouted from sidewalks. Children waved through windows. Neighbors learned to help one another without touching. As Eleanor reached for the bowl, Mrs. Donnelly noticed Thomas sitting in the background. Is he ill? He may have been exposed. The widow's expression tightened. I will ask Michael to contact the nurse again in the morning. There are families who need her more. Perhaps. But that does not mean your family needs her less. Mrs. Donnelly returned to her house. At 11 o'clock, Thomas began to shiver. Eleanor added another lump of coal to the stove, though their supply was running low. She wrapped a blanket around his shoulders and measured his temperature. 101. Thomas no longer argued. His eyes had become heavy, and pain spread through his back and legs. He complained that the light was too bright. Eleanor reduced the lamp flame. Influenza often began suddenly. Fever, headache, weakness, and body aches could appear with startling speed. For families who had watched neighbors become critically ill, the first symptoms carried enormous emotional weight. Eleanor tied a fresh mask around her face. "You should stay farther away," Thomas whispered. "I need to cool your forehead. Use a long cloth." "This is not the time for jokes." I was serious. She dipped a cloth in water and placed it across his forehead. "I promised you I would come home," he said. "You did come home. I may have brought it with me." "You may have brought nothing but exhaustion." Thomas closed his eyes. "What if the children? They are upstairs. What if you—" "Stop." He looked at her. "We made choices based on what we knew," Eleanor said. "You went to work because we needed money. You helped that soldier because someone had to. We will not turn every decent thing you did into a reason to blame yourself." Thomas's breathing remained steady, but tears formed at the corners of his eyes. In public accounts of the 1918 pandemic, statistics often dominated cases, deaths, hospital beds, and burial numbers. Yet inside homes, the crisis was measured differently. It was measured in unfinished meals, in empty chairs, in the temperature marked on a glass thermometer, in the number of seconds between one breath and the next. Near midnight, Ruth came downstairs. "I told you to stay with Samuel," Eleanor said. "He's asleep." Ruth carried a pillow and blanket. "I can sit with Father while you rest." "No. You cannot remain awake forever." I said no. Ruth placed the blanket on a chair. Mother, Mrs. Sullivan, became too sick to wake up because there was no healthy adult left in the house. "If you collapse from exhaustion, that will not help Father." Eleanor stared at her daughter. Ruth was 16, but the epidemic had forced her into adulthood with little warning. "All right," Eleanor said. 1 hour. She showed Ruth how to read the thermometer and when to change the cloth on Thomas's forehead. She warned her not to lean near his face and not to touch her own mask. Then Eleanor sat in the kitchen with her head resting on folded arms. She did not truly sleep. At 1 in the morning, Thomas's temperature remained just above 101. It had not risen further. At 2 he drank half a cup of water. At 3 his shivering eased. By 4, exhaustion finally overcame Ruth, and Eleanor resumed her place beside him. The darkest hours of the night passed quietly. That quiet did not mean safety. It meant only that the family was still waiting. At dawn, pale light entered through the curtains. The stove had burned low. Eleanor checked the thermometer once more. 100. She read it twice to be certain. Thomas opened his eyes. "Better?" he asked. "A little." From upstairs came Samuel's footsteps, followed by Ruth telling him not to come down. Then someone knocked at the front door. A visiting nurse stood outside. She appeared exhausted, with shadows beneath her eyes and a bag worn smooth by constant use. Mrs. Donnelly had kept her promise. The nurse examined Thomas in the sitting room while Eleanor and the children waited in the kitchen. She listened to his chest, checked his pulse, and asked when the symptoms had begun. "His lungs sound clear," she finally said. "That is good." "Does he have influenza?" Eleanor asked. "Probably." The answer was direct but not hopeless. "He needs rest, water, and careful watching. Keep him separated from the children. Send for help if his breathing changes or his lips become dark." "Will he recover?" The nurse looked at Thomas, then at Eleanor. "Most people do." It was the most honest reassurance she could offer. Before leaving, the nurse wrote instructions on a scrap of paper. She also examined Ruth and Samuel from a distance. Neither showed signs of fever. Outside, another automobile waited to take her to the next family. "Mrs. Sullivan?" Ruth asked before the nurse stepped away. The nurse recognized the name. "She survived the night." "And Patrick?" "He is very ill." There was no further information. The nurse left. The Miller family's day continued. Breakfast was prepared. Water was boiled. Masks were washed. Samuel completed arithmetic at the kitchen table, while Ruth delivered a note to the streetcar office explaining that Thomas could not report for work. Nothing about the morning felt ordinary. Yet these small routines were the structure holding the household together. Thomas remained ill for 6 days. His fever rose again on the second evening, but his breathing stayed clear. Eleanor cared for him while sleeping only in short intervals. Ruth managed the cooking, lessons, and coal. Samuel drew more pictures and slid them beneath the sitting room door. No one else in the family developed serious symptoms. Across the wall, the Sullivans were less fortunate. Mr. Sullivan recovered slowly. Mary remained healthy. Mrs. Sullivan returned home after nearly 2 weeks. Patrick, their oldest son, died in the hospital. He was 19 years old. There was no large funeral. Public gatherings remained restricted, and the family was still recovering. A small procession passed the Miller home on a gray afternoon. Eleanor, Ruth, and Samuel watched from the window. Thomas, still weak, stood behind them with one hand resting on the wall. The pandemic would eventually loosen its grip on Philadelphia. Schools reopened. Streetcars filled again. Factory whistles returned to their regular schedules. Families stepped cautiously back into theaters, churches, stores, and public streets. But the city was changed. More than 12,000 people died in Philadelphia during the influenza pandemic. Across the United States, hundreds of thousands were lost. Many deaths occurred not in public institutions, but inside bedrooms, kitchens, boarding houses, farmhouses, apartments, and narrow row homes like the Millers. History often remembers disasters through their largest moments. The parade that should have been canceled. The hospitals that overflowed. The officials who acted too late. The numbers printed in newspapers. But for the people who lived through the epidemic, survival was built from smaller moments. A bowl of soup left on a doorstep. A teenager willing to help a frightened child. A widow ringing a bell to summon neighbors. A nurse entering one more infected home. A father helping a sick stranger even when he knew the risk. And a family remaining awake through the night, listening to one another breathe. The day inside the Miller home had appeared quiet from the street. The curtains remained drawn. No dramatic event was visible to those passing outside. Yet behind the closed door, the family had faced the central question of the 1918 influenza pandemic. How could people protect themselves without abandoning one another? There was no perfect answer. Only caution, responsibility, sacrifice, and the hope that morning would come before another life was lost.